I didn't know my neighbor's name until the day he murdered my uncle. Early one morning, a neighborhood feud between two men escalated into a firefight, and courtroom testimony would later tell us that my uncle's neighbor kicked down my uncle's front door and then methodically shot him twice in the ankles, twice in the knees, and once in the heart. And he never spent a night in jail. Freed on bond because he was an upstanding citizen, the court cleared him of all charges on the basis of self-defense. He went back to his wife, his home, his job, while our family picked up the pieces. We shampooed the blood from the carpet, but nothing could erase the horror from our minds. On morning walks with my young daughter, I avoided the street where he lived. Only a few blocks from my own, I couldn't bear to see evidence of life as usual because it stood in such stark contrast to the shuttered windows and the empty driveway of my uncle's home. Only a narrow strip of grass separated their two homes, but an eternity separated their souls. And after a few months, I resumed my familiar route, which led me past his house. And sometimes I'd see him leaving for work or returning home, and bitterness began to grow in my heart. What right does he have to live as though nothing has happened? Doesn't it matter that he killed a man? Why should he go about his daily life while my uncle will never laugh or love or play again? And the sin of bitterness, along with its cousins, hurt and anger, began to grow deep roots in my heart and sprout poisonous fruit. One night, unable to sleep because of the thoughts churning in my head, I sought comfort in the scriptures, and I opened my Bible to Luke 16, the chapter of Lazarus and the rich man. And as I read of the rich man's torment, I realized that while my uncle's murderer had escaped the punishment he deserved here on earth, no fast-talking lawyer would ever be able to protect him from the justice that faced him in eternity. Don't begrudge him his life here on earth, I sense the Lord saying to me. This may be the only heaven that he ever experiences. And if it weren't for the grace of God, this would also be true of you, he said to me. And suddenly, instead of bitterness and resentment, I felt an overwhelming sense of pity for this man who so desperately needed a Savior, just like I had. And then the Lord spoke again. Tell him that very rarely for a righteous man, someone might die. And perhaps for a good man, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his love for us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Well, I know I couldn't walk up to his house and knock on his door and tell him about Jesus. He was, after all, a murderer. So I did the next best thing. I wrote him a letter, and in the letter I shared with him how much his actions had hurt my family. And I told him how bitterness had started to grow in my heart. But then I shared with him how God had saved me from an equally sinful nature and how he extends forgiveness to all men. And I offered my forgiveness. Because God has forgiven me, I wrote, I forgive you. And I'll probably never know if my uncle's murderer received God's gift of salvation, but that's not my responsibility. My responsibility was to tell him what he did next was between him and God. And now when I walk past his house, instead of bitterness and resentment, I pray for him. And I hope one day that my prayers will help set him free. Is there someone in your life that you're struggling to forgive? Forgiving doesn't deny the hurt and the pain and the sin, but it lances the festering sore and it allows the poison to drain, and it helps healing begin. Lewis Smead once said, forgiveness sets the prisoner free. And then you realize that the prisoner is you. God said, if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. Choose forgiveness today.